Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband, wife, or parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away. And he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years. She was my whole life. What do I do without her?" It breaks me up every time.
We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description.
Story 2. Nurse. In hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness, not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice. Response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers and not mine. She did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. Story 3. My husband is a PICU nurse, and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights the little boy would wake up, so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that. He read him a book and just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep, the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning. His little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband, and he felt terrible about it, because clearly he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. Story 4. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and sitting half up in bed. And a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow, and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. This is kind of creepy. That's almost like a superpower. This nurse is halfway to talking to the dead. Also, just a side note, I could never survive doing a job like this. I would not be able to handle any of it. Huge props to those who can. Story 5. When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly, and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed intubation. I explained all this to him, and I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed, and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later, I was on call covering the ICU, and he was barely hanging on. I knew he wasn't going to make it through the night. He went into VFib several times, and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and died shortly after. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke to me were saying, "Please don't let me die." Story 6. Not a medical worker, but when I was 16, my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who is always a big goof, was playing along with the joke that he and another classmate were breaking up, and said, "This relationship is over," and then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect, because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition, acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back, I was struck by how discolored his face was, and then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely screwed with me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment. Story 7. Had a patient on the cardiac ICU during my 2nd month of intern year who had newly diagnosed heart failure that we couldn't figure out what caused it. He was a healthy guy in his 60s, did yoga every day, walked a few miles 5 days a week, genuinely nice guy, which is always a bad prognostic sign. With his heart failure, his heart was so stretched out and not squeezing adequately to provide the blood and subsequent oxygen he needs to the rest of his body. A few nights into his hospital stay, I come in the next morning and discovered that the senior resident had to code him for sustained unstable heart arrhythmia. I went and talked with him about it the next morning, and he told me that he was in and out of consciousness during it all from the low blood pressure, but he compared it to the feeling of jumping out of the plane and skydiving. Later that morning, I was checking on him again, and he didn't look so good. He goes into the arrhythmia again, drops his blood pressure, and is in and out of consciousness. As I'm charging the defibrillator to shock him again, he comes back and briefly asks me if I'm taking him skydiving again, and lets out a nervous laugh before losing consciousness. Story 8. Not a medical worker, but my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemo and one surgery, and overall his prognosis looked really good. He had gone through another surgery and was due to be released from the hospital a couple days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you, my love." And obviously she thinks nothing of it, saying, "I'll miss you too, I'll be back in the morning." Couple hours later, he was gone. Story 9. My buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient, probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to go get coffee, and my buddy had to check on her vitals. They were normal. Then she woke up, smiled, and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I didn't marry you. My family wouldn't let me, but I will now. I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes, and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone, just like that. Her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we are black, and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago, because she was looking right at him when she spoke. I don't know. It's weird. Story 10. I was with my father as he lay dying in the hospital. It was a long and emotionally exhausting process. So we kids took turns sitting with him and holding his hand for when he would wake up. He was in and out of lucidity, but just before he went, he opened his eyes, gripped my hand hard, looked me in the eye, and said, "I don't like that guy in the black suit sitting over in the corner." My blood ran cold, and I quickly looked over my shoulder and there was an empty chair there. I don't know if he was remembering some incident from his past, hallucinating, or if he saw someone more sinister. I didn't mention it to my siblings for years, and even since then, they don't like to talk about it. Okay, but like, what a sick last prank this would be, no? That would scare someone for life. You would definitely get the last laugh. And honestly, I don't put it past a father. Story 11. I worked as a PA for a clinic, so I'll never be involved in that situation, but I know a friend who has been. She is also a PA and was helping a guy who was terminally ill. Before he passed, he asked her to not let his wife have his crap. Of course, she listens and is sympathetic. A day or so after he passed, his ex-wife apparently shows up to the hospital with several kids saying she's in this guy's will. Long story short, she was trying to take his crap. Story 12. Not my patient, but a friend of mine. He had a patient with an AAA. Abdominal aortic aneurysm. Basically, your aorta is bulging and throbbing about ready to pop. The pain is very severe and agonizing, and if it does rupture, the pain immediately goes away and feels so good. But your chances of survival are pretty much non-existent, even if you're prepped on the operating table when it ruptures. Anyway, he had a 15-year-old with one, and on the way to the hospital, she looks at him and just says, "Oh, that feels so much better," and died about 10 seconds later. Story 13. During my residency, I was on call and running the hospital, as senior residents tend to do. One of my responsibilities was being in charge of the entire ICU, which had about 16 to 20 bed capacity. I was taking care of a man who had a bowel perforation, a hole in his intestines. He had an NG, nasogastric tube, up in his nose, which went into his stomach so that he wouldn't drown in his own feces. His brother and sister-in-law came to visit him and they had a nice conversation. I walked in as they were leaving and they said to him, "Make sure to listen to the doctor," as they left. The patient and I talked a bit, and he wasn't looking too good. I kept hearing a gargling sound as he was speaking to me, the kind of sound you make when you rinse out your mouth with mouthwash and spit it out. I immediately checked his NG tube and it came right out. He looked at me and said, "I shouldn't have played with the tube," before going pale and losing a pulse. I did everything in my power to save him that day, but his lungs were full of stool, and he died 20 minutes later. The rest of the day I felt utterly numb, and it sits with me to this day. To have a patient smiling and laughing with you one moment, and then being deceased 20 minutes later, one hell of a roller coaster ride. Story 14. Not a healthcare worker, but my grandfather passed this week at 89 years old. He was a very sharp, sane man, not senile or any dementia. The 2 days leading to his passing, he began to see things. He told me, "Do you see Michelangelo painting?" I said, "No." He said, "He's painting invisible dust. Everything he paints disappears. I hope the bathroom is still there." He also told us he could see little men jumping from the fan blades. It was really strange. It sounded like he was tripping acid, but obviously he wasn't. He prayed over and over the night before he passed. We found him deceased in the morning. Story 15. Work in EMS. This doesn't happen very often. However, I do distinctly recall an elderly gentleman who was determined to die in his home. Kept saying, "I'm not going back to the hospital. I'm going to die here." Guy was having a pretty massive MI, was going to be dead in less than 12 hours. His wife and son pleaded for him to go to the hospital with us, told him to think about his grandbabies, told him point blank he was going to die if he stayed, reminded him about how alone and scared his wife would be, tried so damned hard to figure out why he was afraid to go back. My unit and fire stayed on scene for over an hour trying to convince him to go. Even called a doctor to chat with him. He was old, but not old enough to go out just yet. Still mobile, still fully present mentally. Sadly, we can't take people against their will. It's considered kidnapping. Eventually, we had to leave him. He was dead the next morning. The funny thing is, I respect the hell out of him. I think he knew something we couldn't accept. That he would pass, even with intervention. I wouldn't want my body worked on if I knew I was going to die anyway. Resuscitation is a violent, often fruitless endeavor. The most haunting thing for me isn't the death or gore itself. It's hearing the family screaming when death is announced. Hearing people, especially children, scream for their mothers is the most painful for me. Story 16. Had a patient that kept coding, but every time they came back, they would get crazy strong, fight everyone, and then start saying the Lord's Prayer. Then they would trail off and code again. Another one snatched me by the arm and pleaded that they wanted to see their baby grow up. 60 seconds later, I was pumping away on their chest. In my line of work, I hear a lot of last words. These two, though, surprisingly weren't the final last words. I just thought they were, and at the time it was a perfectly rational thought. Of actual last words, my favorites were always, "I want you to go away and leave me alone. I'm going to sleep. Goodbye." Family members didn't pick up on that one, but that patient and his eyes said it all. Story 17. I'm a nurse. I started off working in Pediatric's ER. Toward the end of my first year, this woman came in with her 8-year-old daughter who was feeling dizzy and had a poor appetite. She hadn't had her flu shot and it was flu season, so she took her in because her symptoms were bad enough that she was worried that she may need medical intervention. So we asked her a few questions. Then, I noticed this huge red bruise on her side that covered half of her side. I noticed another one on her back when we went to check her heartbeat. Then she fainted. We were able to get her stable, and when she woke up, she said she was just feeling weak. Because we were thinking flu, we got her hooked up to an IV. I mentioned the bruises to the doctor, and he asked the mother to leave so we could talk to the little girl in private. She nodded and looked down shamefully. We asked her what, and that's when she told us she was bleeding. She admitted that for a month she had a lot of nosebleeds at school, at least a few times a week. And then she showed us something that terrified us. She showed us an ulcer she had inside of her lip. We went from thinking flu to abuse to cancer really fast. We sent her to get some tests done ASAP, and never heard back. A few weeks later, I transferred to St. Jude's. Turns out she was getting treated there, and her tests came back positive for leukemia. She was not doing well. I was working as a chemotherapy nurse right away, and would work with her a lot, along with a few other patients. She just got worse. Before one session, she looked at me with the saddest eyes and said, "I don't think I'm going to live for much longer. Tell my mom that I love her more than anything and anyone else." It was so heartbreaking to hear, but nurses have to be stoic, and I had to suck it up. After that session, another nurse took over, and I ran outside and broke down crying. She died that night in her sleep. Story 18. I was taking care of this guy with stage 4 cancer who had altered mental status. No cancer in the brain on imaging, couldn't find out what was wrong, was getting worse. Made comfort care. Morning that he died, he actually looked better and said, "Hey, doc, I'm scared. Can we talk about this?" And I said, "Sure, I'll come back after rounds." My plan was to come back after lunch to talk with him. On my way down to get my food, my pager goes off saying that the patient had died. He was scared of dying. He wanted someone to talk to, and he died terrified. Really my only regret of my career so far. Story 19. Not me, but my aunt likes to tell this story a lot. She was with a patient and they got told nicely that they had 2 weeks left to live. The patient looked to my aunt and then said the date, the 12th of October. It was July, and my aunt was very confused as to why he said that. Anyway, he passed about a week later. My aunt put that date into her calendar, highly intrigued, expecting that nothing would happen. But then on the 12th of October, a patient came in with a severe illness and said, "Other patient's name has said you've been expecting me." To this day, this freaks me out, and I don't know what happened or how this happened. But I am scared to death that we are in fact living in a simulation. That's I don't even know what to say. That's horrifying. I don't even know exactly what I would be thinking at that moment, but I would be turning to God or something. Story 20. RN here. We had a patient in our unit for a year almost. He was so mean, thought we were always hurting him when we tried caring for him. Every interaction was very unpleasant. Well, I just had a bad breakup and was the world is ending depressed. The day he died, he was calm and asked me if I was married, which at the time made me kinda sad. So I just answered, "No, I'm not." And he just said, "You'll find someone. And I know you aren't trying to hurt me." It was so concise, to the point, and memorable for me. It was the sweetest thing he could have said to me, and given the scenario, I would say it was the sweetest thing anyone has said. On his deathbed, no formalities, just telling me what he had always wanted to talk to me about. I cried when I left his room, and he passed away right at 7 p.m. when my shift ended, so I got to be with him. Story 21. Not his final words, but a couple of years ago, my grandfather choked during lunch. Paramedics revived him, but by the time he made it to the hospital, there was no brain activity. I made my way from Houston to Tulsa to say my goodbyes and sat vigil with my grandmother. She still hadn't accepted that he was gone, no brain activity for 48 hours. As I sat with her at this bedside, she was talking to him. "It's time to wake up, Johnny." She had been married to this man for 65 years and was basically just begging for a little more time. That had a profound effect on me as I had just gone through a pretty brutal divorce. I think we all did something right if we spend 65 years with someone and at the end they are still asking for more time. Story 22. I had a guy who had a cardiac arrest at a swimming pool. He came to my ICU. The lifeguards had managed to get him back at the poolside, so a short downtime, which usually is a good thing. Turns out he had dysarrhythmia, funny heartbeat, which had to be resolved. So we woke him up from his medically induced coma and he was great. Smiling, waving, talking. He remembered feeling unwell in the swimming pool, etc. Fast forward 2 hours and his nurse starts shouting for help. The guy is screaming and really agitated. He grabs me and looks me square in the eyes and shouts, "Something really bad is about to happen." I have never seen fear or panic like it. He pulls out all his lines. He bites through his arterial line, so he's losing blood everywhere. And he's standing on the bed screaming. We cannot calm him down or reassure him he's safe. He just screams and shouts and panics. And then he stops, collapses and goes into cardiac arrest and dies. In the medical profession, we talk about a sense of impending doom. I now work in palliative care, so I see a lot of people who die. But this was so visceral. He was so scared it was harrowing. I will never forget the look in his eyes. Story 23. Years ago, I had a patient who had dementia, but he was also aphasic due to CVA. She was a DNR. Anyway, I went in about an hour to 45 minutes before my shift was up to check her over, make sure she and the room was good for the next shift. However, this time she seemed really interested in trying to talk to me. This was unusual. She didn't seem like she was in duress, though. VS looked good and she had no signs of pain or discomfort. Turned her, fluffed the pillows, new linens, made sure she was clean and dry. I tried my best to gather some grasp of what she wanted, but to no avail. I spent the better part of the last part of my shift trying to figure out what she was trying to tell me. Eventually, I got called out of the room to help another patient. Just before my shift ended, I got a call from the monitor tech asking me to check the telemetry leads on her, as they weren't getting a signal. I go into the room to find her asystolic. She had died in the 10 or 15 minutes from when I left the room. She had no family to speak of. She was a DNR at that point, and it wasn't much of a surprise. But I often wonder what she was trying to tell me, and I feel a lot of guilt that maybe I missed something, and that ultimately she died alone. Still haunts me.